Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here now and continue our discussion on the brain and spinal cord today. Do you have any questions on anything? Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Okay, when we were talking, the last thing we talked about, we're looking at motor areas in the cerebral hemispheres. And the frontal lobe is the source of most of our motor areas, the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex. Primary motor cortex is in the precentral gyrus, the ridge right in front of the central sulcus. The central sulcus is located right here. There's the precentral gyrus. There's the primary motor cortex that initiates motor activities. The premotor cortex involves planning, for example. And now we're looking at some of the more specialized areas here. We have the frontal eye field located right at that juncture of the premotor and the primary motor cortex. This controls movement of the eyeballs in the sockets, the 6 extrinsic muscles that surround the eyeball, the movement of the eyes turning towards stimulus, things like that. The other area, and it's directly above and slightly behind the area called Broca's area. Broca's area, first of all, Broca's area is a motor area only on the left-hand side. Now, most motor areas are going to be on both sides of the cerebral hemisphere, on the left side and the right side. Because remember, our brain is contralateral. We control the left side of our body with the right side of our brain. And the right side of the brain controls the left side. I said that. Anyway, Broca's area controls speech, controls our tongue, our teeth, our mouth, our lips, so that we can produce sounds. It's only on the left-hand side, so it's our speech area. And so all of the noises that we make with our mouth are controlled on the left-hand side of our cortex in the area we call Broca's area. There's no Broca's area on the right-hand side. Now, this is only about speech. It has nothing to do with comprehension. There's another area we deal with comprehension, but right now we're just looking at the motor activity of producing sounds. So those are the motor areas. The frontal lobe deals with the premotor and the primary motor area, plus the visual field and Broca's area. That's everything in front of the central sulcus. Now, the central sulcus is, you see this red area highlighted here. The central sulcus is immediately in front of that. So everything in front of the central sulcus is the frontal lobe. Everything behind the central sulcus is this red highlighted area, and behind. That red area is known as the post-central gyrus, the ridge behind the central sulcus. And so we have 7 different sensory areas found in the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. We have the primary somatosensory cortex, which is actually what's showing up in that red area in the post-central gyrus. We have the somatosensory association area or cortex. We have the visual areas. We have the olfactory, gustatory, and vestibular cortexes too. So the primary somatosensory cortex found in the post-central gyrus. There's the central sulcus right in the middle, right between the orange frontal lobe and the purple parietal lobe. Highlighted there with that blue oval, there's the central sulcus. The oval highlights the post-central gyrus, the gyrus behind the central sulcus. The orange one to the left is the precentral gyrus. The central sulcus is our landmark here. So the primary somatosensory cortex, sensory input from our skin, sensory input from the proprioceptors are coming in here. They're passing through the thalamus and going to the post-central gyrus. This primary somatosensory cortex is coming in here. Now, remember, the sensory receptors are just picking up sensations. They have no comprehension as to what they're doing. There is no perception from the sensory receptors. Perception is going to be taking place in here, in the cortex. So the somatosensory association cortex is right behind the primary somatosensory cortex. So the association area, if here is in the post-central gyrus, there's our somatosensory cortex. Right behind it is our association area. Somatosensory association area. The somatosensory association area can take all the input coming in from the skin, from the proprioceptors, and put it together in one comprehensive picture. That's what association is all about. It integrates all the data, all the input to give you a comprehensive picture. For example, if you were to reach into your pocket and you wanted to pull out your car keys, or you wanted to reach in and find your house key, for example, as opposed to a car key or a car fob, or if you just wanted to reach in and get a quarter, as opposed to a nickel or a dime. It's harder and harder to find good analogies here because we don't use much change anymore, and most of us have key fobs, so we don't use the keys. So, but indulge me. You're reaching into your pocket to find something, okay? The ability to discriminate, to determine what the object is that you're reaching for without looking at it is based on all the sensory input that is coming in to the somatosensory area. The somatosensory cortex is then sharing that information with the association area to tell us exactly what it is. What's it feel like? What's its shape? What's its size? Is it rough? Is it smooth? Does it have protrusions on there? What is our memory of what we put in our pocket that day? All the different things you might have in a pocket that you would be able to identify what it is. If you had damage to the association area, you would not be able to tell what you were feeling. You would have to pull it out of your pocket and look at it so that you would know it's not a pencil, it's a pocket knife. It's not your wallet, it's your phone. Your wallet and your phone are the same size. It's not a pen, it's the pencil. It's, you know, all these, it's not a quarter, it's a nickel. You would have to look at it. If the sensory area, the primary somatosensory cortex is functional, but the association area is damaged, you would not be able to identify objects by touch, feel, shape, temperature, whatever. You would not be able to process that information. If the cortex is damaged, if the somatosensory cortex is damaged, you aren't going to be able to receive the information because it's not getting there. If the cortex is damaged, then you can't associate it. If the cortex is damaged, you don't know, you know, you're probably not aware of the sensation. But in a healthy cortex, the somatosensory area would receive input from all the touch, pressure, temperature receptors on your skin and in your muscles, and tell you what it is that you are touching, feeling, finding in your pocket, being able to discriminate in shape and size of the coin or the pocket knife versus a pencil or a wallet from your phone. So the association area allows you to tell you what you're looking at. The sensory area has to bring the input there. All the sensory area does is receive the input from the sensory receptors going by way of the thalamus. Once you get that input, then you can process it and figure out what it is. Now, the visual cortex is in the occipital lobe. It is the largest of all the cortexes there. It's contralateral. The left eyeball gives information to both the left and right side of the brain. The right eyeball gives information to both of the left and right side of the brain, all in the occipital lobe. This is where the action potentials that come down from the optic nerve to the optic tract. Remember, it's a tract now, because it's, you know, once we get into the brain, it's in the central nervous system, it's a tract. And you can see there's the optic tract there. Once the information gets back here, all those action potentials are now received in the occipital lobe. But again, they don't mean anything yet. They're still just action potentials. It is this massive association area surrounding the visual cortex. It tells us what we're seeing. Now, if the visual cortex is damaged in any way where it can't receive the signals, then we have functional blindness. The eyeballs may be working just fine. Remember, they're just receptors. The eyeballs may be working just fine, but the signal can't be processed when it gets to the visual cortex because the visual cortex is damaged. But in a healthy individual, the eyeballs work, they generate action potentials which come to the visual cortex, and now we have to interpret what they mean. And that's where the association area is going to come into play. The visual cortex back here in this purple area of our occipital lobe, which actually is pretty much, you know, the whole part of the occipital lobe, is now going to be processed by the association area, which surrounds it. The visual association area is huge. The visual cortex will tell us what areas of the retina are being stimulated. But it's the association area that tells us what we're seeing. It pulls in all the information on size, color, shape, appearance, memory, brings in, you know, actions that have to happen. What do you do when the light turns yellow? What do you do, you know, when it turns red? You're driving down the road, these things. The association area tells us what we are seeing. If the visual association area is damaged, we can't comprehend what we're looking at. We can see it, but we don't know what it means. We have no comprehension. If the cortex is damaged, we can't see. If the association area is damaged, we don't understand. We have no perception of what's going on. We're getting images, but it means nothing to us. So the visual association area surrounds the visual cortex. This is the largest of the cortexes in the cortex in the cerebral hemispheres, because we do so much with vision. Okay. The auditory cortex, it's on the temporal lobe. It is where we receive auditory input, action potentials coming down from the auditory nerve. And then the association area surrounds that auditory cortex and tells us what we're hearing. Because again, we can't tell. The auditory cortex is just receiving action potentials, but the association area tells us what it is. Olfactory cortex in the frontal lobe, just above the eye orbits. We send signals from the olfactory receptors embedded in the superior surface of the interior of the nasal cavity, up in here, right here. There's our olfactory epithelial cells, and we generate action potentials or graded potentials that may become action potentials, and we send those signals into the olfactory bulb, which goes into the olfactory tract, and then that goes into the frontal lobe. And if we have threshold, we detect an odor. But again, we have to determine what those odors are. That's where the association area comes in. It tells us what those odors are. We depend on the memory of various odors to tell what we're smelling. And that's where the association area tells us. We have about 10,000 odors stored in our memory. And there is an incredible link between emotional responses and memory. Odors and memory and emotions. We will trigger all that very, very, very quickly. Certain odors will trigger memories. Memories trigger emotions a lot faster than the way I just described it. The gustatory and vestibular cortex. Vestibular, of course, is balance and equilibrium. The gustatory cortex and association area is in the parietal lobe, just behind the temporal lobe. So we process taste, and we remember what the tastes are thanks to the association area. Balance and equilibrium are processed in the insula. The insula is deep to the temporal lobe. So this is where the insula comes in, where we do our input from the semicircular canals. So we have quite a few association areas here. I've alluded to them already. Now, the Somatosensory Association area is going to integrate and interpret sensory input from the skin, from the proprioceptors. The visual association area surrounding the visual cortex is going to recognize, evaluate, identify, process. Auditory association area. Now, this is a new location here. This is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is where we turn words into speech. Broca's area is how we speak. Broca's area is up here in right at this area there's Broca's area. There's the motor speech area is Broca's area. But the comprehension of the word and the ability to speak the proper word is Wernicke's. And Wernicke's is back here. back here allows us to, in Wernicke's, allows us to understand what the word means. Understand what the word means and respond with the correct word, or speak clearly, or to read clearly, to understand the written word, to be able to read something and or to write something out. Now, damage in Wernicke's means that your patient can still speak. Because, you know, if the Wernicke's area is damaged, your patient can still speak. They can still write things out. They can still read, but they can't understand. What they write down is nonsense. What they read to them is nonsense. What they're hearing is nonsense words. What they're saying is nonsense words. Their speech area still works just fine. Their comprehension area is damaged for both reading and writing. Now, maybe it's only the reading area. Maybe it's the speaking area only. Maybe it's only the writing area. Maybe maybe it's some variation on all that. Maybe they can't speak clearly. Maybe they can speak. Maybe they speak nonsense, but they can write it out correctly. Who knows? But if they can still speak clearly, but not understood, then it's damage in Wernicke's. So you have a couple of things going on here with your patient. If your patient has suffered trauma to the head, or if they've suffered a stroke, for example, and they can't speak, then it's Broca's area that's affected. If they can't speak, but they can understand, if they can write it out, it's only in Broca's area. If they can't speak, can't understand, can't write anything, it affects both Broca's and Wernicke's area. Both Wernicke's and Broca's are only on the left-hand side. So if your patient has the inability to speak clearly, to speak at all, then it's likely some sort of damage here in Broca's. If they can comprehend what you're saying or what you're writing out, then it's localized in Broca's area, the damage. If they can speak but not understand what you're saying, then it's in Wernicke's back here. And if they can neither speak or comprehend, then it's all along the left-hand side. So, okay, so the auditory association area, where we put words into meaning and they become speech. Wernicke's is back on the temporal parietal area, sort of at the border of the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, and even the occipital lobe is where Wernicke's is located. The Gnostic area puts together all of the senses to give you a comprehensive picture of everything going on. The frontal eye field, we mentioned that already. Now here's an area we haven't discussed yet. The frontal eye field, of course, is moving the eyeballs to look at things, like you're looking at the screen right now, and you're going back and forth. You know, your eyes are moving across the words, the text on the screen, and looking at the images and trying to match up the tiny little lines with the words to the areas on the brain. That is the premotor area. I'm sorry, that is the frontal eye field. And of course, we also have the premotor area, which is right in front of the primary motor area, functions as an association area too, because our primary motor area tells us to do something. Our premotor area is telling us what to do. You know, if you're going to ride a bicycle, your primary motor area says, okay, get on the bicycle and start riding it. The premotor area tells us how to do that. So it takes the signals from the primary motor area and processes them so that we know how to pedal, how to steer, how to not fall off, how to maintain our balance, how to move our bodies back and forth, side to side, so we can retain our balance and still pedal at the same time, depending on, you know, how to use the brakes, how to use how to select gears, all these things. So the premotor area does function as an association area for us by taking the original signal and processing it to give us a, we want to do this, this is how we do it. Okay, so our cortex, our cerebral cortex, doesn't operate in a vacuum. There's multiple inputs from multiple areas. There is output to multiple areas. So we're always receiving sensory input from odors and sounds and touch and pressure and pain. And all these are coming together, all this visual input and auditory input plus tactile input. Chemoreceptors are detecting things in the air. We're receiving all this input, and we're sending this out to all different areas of our bodies. And so we understand what's going on around us. It tells us where we are. It tells us what we're doing. It tells us why we're doing something. It helps us decide on the actions we're going to take based on the current knowledge and previous experiences and memories. Driving down the road, you respond to different things that happen to you while you're driving down the road based on knowledge and previous experience and stored memories. If you have a flat tire as you're driving down the road, if you have a blowout, which happens occasionally, you respond. You know how to respond to that tire going flat suddenly. Based on things that have happened to you, you know what to do. Or maybe you don't know what to do, but at least you know, well, I've got something going on, I better get off the road. That is an output. So, because we have this comprehensive picture of what's going on. And we get our response that way. Everything about us is coming from the cortex. Our thoughts, our emotions, our sensations, our conscious actions, all of that is making us who we are. How do we respond? Do we respond with irritation? Do we respond with logical, oh, well, let's figure this out? Do we respond emotionally? How do we respond? Do we start figuring out how to solve the problem right away? Or do we have to have a period of running around, in circles before we get there? Because some people do that too. Who and what we are is all determined in the cortex. How we respond to life around us is determined in the cortex. Now, our cortex has three distinct areas. We have what's known as the anterior association area, the posterior association area, and of course, the limbic area. So we mentioned the limbic area already. So the anterior area is the prefrontal cortex. It is the front of the frontal cortex, the front of the frontal lobe. This is the most sophisticated and complicated region of all the cortices. Our intellect is found here. Our cognition, our ability to process information, our awareness is located here. Our ability to remember facts, places, names, dates, people, all this recall is located here. Our personality, for good or for bad, is located in the prefrontal cortex. All of our working memory is located there. Our working memory allows us to recognize things like stop signs or people, or how to use a phone, or what number you want to call. If you have a flat tire, who do you call? Or how do you use the phone? How do you drive your car? All of this is working memory. It allows us to use judgment, good judgment, bad judgment. It allows us to figure out problems. It gives us the persistence we need to try and solve a problem. And we plan our activities. All of this is taking place in the prefrontal cortex. Our sense of right and wrong is in the prefrontal cortex. Our sense of fairness, our sense of good judgment, bad judgment, our sense of conscience is in the prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex develops from input from our social environment. What's that mean? It means that, you know, our peers and our family teach us right and wrong. What is good, what is bad. We learn from previous experiences. We judge our behavior. You know, our behavior when we enter kindergarten changes from the time we start to the time we enter. Our behavior as a freshman in high school is different than our behavior 4 years later when we graduate. The same as when we start college and when we end college, or we start our first job and go on to our next job, or maybe we stay there for 40 years. Our behavior changes over time based on social input. Peer pressure alters our behavior. We learn on how to work with people and get along with people, or not. Now, problems with our prefrontal cortex. A person who starts showing irregular behavior in the anterior association area may have a tumor. They may start showing irregular behavior. They may have personality disorders. They may change from happy to sad to angry, all, you know, one after another. They may lose their inhibitions. They may lose their ability to make good judgments. They may not pay attention. They may ignore the normal social restraints. Now, there are things we do in public and there are things we don't do in public. And they may all be gone. A lesion, a tumor in the anterior association area may be driving all of this. Damage to the association area may show up in changes in behavior. You know, trauma to the anterior association area can drive this. You know, in the posterior association area, it's a different thing. You know, so in the anterior association area where we have our sense of right and wrong, our justice, our fairness, our conscience level, things like that, we lose our judgment, we lose our inhibitions. But in the posterior association area, a tumor in that area affects our awareness of where we are. You know, this is where a lot of our proprioception is being received. And saying, well, that's not me. You know, a tumor in that area may cause an individual to not even recognize part of their body, or to not acknowledge part of their body because they don't see it as belonging to them. So different areas can have different complications here depending on what kind of lesion we're talking about. So, okay, so that was the prefrontal area. Again, all of our sense of fairness, our sense of right and wrong, our sense of good and bad develop in here over time. We are aware of these things. We are aware of our behavior. We learn what is acceptable behavior and what isn't acceptable behavior. We grow over time. Maybe we don't. Maybe we don't grow as well as we should. Some people don't. Other people do. Other people maybe grow excessively in the sense of right and wrong. You know, but this is the prefrontal cortex. Again, all of our working memory is there. You know, the ability to remember a date or a name or a place, or, you know, the working memory is the memory we use here and now. looking at the computer screen, it's a computer. You're reading words. All this is working memory, so. Now let's talk about the posterior association area. This is where we have all of the sensory processing, all the sensory input and all the association areas that can process it. This allows us to understand words, images, sounds. We recognize odors. We know where we are in space. Our proprioceptors dump into here, telling us where we are. We understand the written word. We understand the spoken word. This is, where Wernicke's is at play. So all of this is in the posterior association area. So we use this to tell us how to talk to people, how to recognize faces, to recognize patterns, the patterns in music, patterns in food, so that we recognize, so we, and this is an area that's very important to us, so that, like if you're looking for, following directions, looking for an address, if you're looking for, you're sorting material out, you're trying to, we follow all, you're putting something together. We use the posterior association area to do all this for us. So, and again, this is, there's the central sulcus right there. It's everything behind the central sulcus is going to be the posterior association area, visual association, Wernicke's area, the primary auditory cortex, the auditory association area, the gustatory association, the olfactory association. All of this gives us a comprehensive picture of everything around us, from the tactile and odor and sound, things like that, things that the frontal lobe isn't doing for us. Frontal lobe is all about personality, right and wrong, good or bad, conscience, speaking clearly type stuff, working through your muscles correctly. That's all. Prefrontal cortex is the pointy end of the stick, if you will, as far as who we are. Mentioned this already about Wernicke's area. There's a term here called aphasia. Aphasia is the inability to use or comprehend words. So we have two types of aphasia. In other words, they can't speak. Non-fluent aphasia means that they can't use their words. They can't form words. Damage to Wernicke's. Fluent aphasia is the inability to understand the written or spoken word. So what happens here, if we have damage to Wernicke's, we have fluent aphasia. We can't comprehend what the words mean or what the written word or spoken word means. Non-fluent aphasia is that we can't speak properly. So if Broca's is damaged, it's non-fluent aphasia. If Wernicke's is damaged, it's fluent aphasia. So the two speech areas in the cortex, Wernicke's for comprehension, Broca's for speaking. And that leaves us with the limbic area. Limbic association is part of our limbic system. I've mentioned this already. The cingulate gyrus, the hippocampal gyrus, and the hippocampus. This gives us the emotional input to establish memories in the cortex. So we use, for good or for bad, our limbic system stores memories. How do we respond? to a crisis? How do we respond to fear? How do we respond to road rage? How do we deal with frustration? This is what the limbic system does for us. It takes those memories of previous experiences and tells us how to react during frustration or working on a difficult problem, to give us the fear response, for example. So everything we mentioned the limbic system does for us is found in this association area. Okay. We also have a general association area. On top of all these specialized association areas, we also have what's known as the general association area. It's usually on the left-hand side. It's made up of the temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes. And this gives us a comprehensive picture of what's going on. So it takes into account visual input, auditory input, olfactory input, touch, temperature, pressure, and tells us exactly where we are at any given time and what we're doing. And that is the general association area. Now, the visceral association area is a perception of visceral stimulus. If we are exposed to a very unpleasant odor and we become nauseated, that's a visceral response. That's the visceral association area, using olfactory and maybe even gustatory, and maybe even visual input to tell us something is unpleasant. And that's the visceral association area is found in the insula. Now I mentioned that we are lateralized. We have different areas on different functions are done on one side of the brain or the other. Spoken language is on the left-hand side. Comprehension is on the left-hand side. Reasoning may be on the left-hand side. Awareness of patterns may be on the right-hand side. Facial recognition and emotional response on the faces. If someone is looking at you and they appear to be annoyed. Now, while we do not have the ability to read minds and understand what someone's thinking, we can at least gain some insight by the appearance in their face and say, and suspect that maybe we've done something inappropriate. Also our ability to recognize a musical pattern may be on the right-hand side. So while we have the specialized regions here, it doesn't mean that the sections of the brain don't communicate with each other, because the two hemispheres communicate not only within the hemispheres and with the spinal cord, but also from side to side. So we do, we've often heard the phrase, someone's left brain, someone's right brain. If someone is left brain, they're supposed to be able to do more reasoning and logical processing, and is good with math and science, for example. Someone who is right brain is more artistic, more emotional, or more understanding with that, can take a visual image and compare it to a spatial relationship. They play Tetris really well, for example, or they can look at an object and decide and figure out how to put it together. They have the instructions and they don't need the instructions. They can look at the package of the thing they're trying to assemble, and they can visualize it. Others have to follow the instructions line by line by line, or you've got the ones that don't need the written instructions, but do need visual instructions. So we fall into those three different areas there. There's a lot of crossing over of these specialized areas. Many people are very good in science, but not good in math. Many people enjoy music and also enjoy have scientific skills. Some people have no clue to emotional responses, but are very good at reasoning problems. So just because, one side of the brain seems to dominate more than the other doesn't mean that that's how it's always going to be. We tend to be a mixture of these various specializations. Now, here is one area that really affects all of us, and that is memory. Memory, the ability to store information, the ability to retrieve information and apply it. We have three different types of memory that we deal with. We have what's known as short-term memory. That is the here and now immediate memory. Writing down a name, writing down a website, looking up a phone number, looking up a website address, hearing a name, someone gives you their name, something you try to remember. The problem with short-term memory is it is very, very short. And you can't retain it very long. Short-term memory does not retain well. You can't keep it in your mind, in your brain long enough. Working memory is what we do right now. This is you get a website, you look it up, and you go to it, and you don't remember the address that you used to get there because it's at the top of the bar on the cursor bar, and that's great. You don't remember the link. You may remember the name, so you type in the name again, and the link comes up, and you click on the link, and you go there. Working memory is what we're doing in the here and now. So we're constantly applying our skills and our knowledge to do things. Working memory is driving our car and knowing how to drive our car, or looking up a website and going to it and then finding the information you want. You don't care what the address is necessarily. You want the information. You don't care how the computer works. You want the information. That's all you want. You don't care how your phone works. You just want the information. Now, short-term memory is different. Short-term memory is a very small set of information. They describe it as chunks of information, maybe not any longer than a number or two. So our short-term memory is limited to about 7 or 8 chunks of data. Like trying to remember a website or a phone number or an address or someone's name. Very little, you can retain this for a short period of time, or just a short factoid of data. It's hard to remember more than 1 or 2 bits of short-term information. When someone is cramming for an exam, they're flipping through their notes and looking up stuff and trying to remember, okay, got to remember that, got to remember that, got to remember that. The problem with that is you're trying to put short-term information into your memory. You're trying to use short-term information. Every piece of data that you put in is pushing out something else. You would be better off when cramming to try and remember one factoid, one fact, pick a fact that you can't you're trying to remember it and nothing else. Of course, by that point, you should have already been prepared for these, and we won't go into that. We're not dealing with the prefrontal cortex and judgment issues and stuff like that. What we're talking about is a fact. You remember that fact, and you store it in short-term memory. And you can only retain one. So pick a good one. On the other hand, long-term memory is incredible. Long-term memory lets you recall anything you want, anything that you stored in your long-term memory. You can remember names, dates, places, events, activities, friends, family, cars, dogs, cats, houses, anniversaries, holidays, things like that. In short-term memory, we can't even remember a phone number or a website long-term memory, we can remember lots and lots of websites or lots and lots of phone numbers. Prior to the development of cell phones and smartphones, and probably 20 years ago, before the smartphones came along probably about 20 years ago, and we had the ability to have lots of phone numbers at our fingertips. We didn't need to remember them anymore. Because prior to that, people actually carried phone numbers around in their long-term memory. And it was not unusual to be able to remember 20 or 30 phone numbers. Now we can barely remember our own phone number. Somebody asks what our own phone number is, and we have to stop and think because we're used to seeing it on a screen. We're lucky if we can remember one or two phone numbers, and yet 20 years ago we would recall many. We would recall addresses. Now we don't remember addresses. We look them up. They're in our phone. We don't need to. We don't need to know these. But prior to smartphones, when we now have it all stored, it would not be unusual for people to carry lots and lots of addresses and phone numbers in their long-term memory. And yet, but it didn't matter. Short-term memory is still short-term memory. If someone tells you a phone number or a website or an address or a name, we're probably going to forget it pretty quickly. As soon as the next short-term memory piece of information comes along. So short-term memory is something we can only hold on to for a few seconds, maybe a few minutes. Even if we don't try to remember it, if we don't try to associate it with something else, then we're not going to retain it for more than a few seconds. If someone says, "My name is Smith," I'll just pick a name, or Jones, or whatever. Unless you make an active effort to remember that name, you're not going to. If you rehearse it, meaning repetitive study, you can retain that name. So once you can make the conversion from short-term to long-term, then you don't forget it. Now, the ability to retain information is about 9 numbers, or the equivalent of 9 numbers. A phone number, for example, is a good example, is a good type of factoid. As something we're describing about the size and length of a phone number. With 10 digits, 9 or 10 digits that you might remember. That's about all you can contain in short-term memory. And if you don't rehearse it or practice it or go over it a couple times or many times, you're not going to remember it. Long-term memory, of course, is something that lasts long-term. You don't forget it. You may still remember phone numbers of the place you lived when you were a kid. You may remember the address, or you may not, doesn't matter. So now, working memory. That's what we use all the time. Working memory is information that happens in the front of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, as we're going through life on a daily basis. Sights, sounds, feelings, tied to what's happening right now with our long-term memories, so that we know how to respond to what's going on in front of us. So we have the appropriate behavior. We have comprehension. We have reasoning. The light turns red, we don't drive through the light because we process, well, first of all, it's dangerous to drive through a red light. Usually, it's also illegal. And of course, there are consequences for driving through a red light. So, or running over somebody, there's consequences for that too. That's also a little more illegal than just driving through a red light. People get upset when you run over them. So we take the here and now stimulus and apply it to all of our stored information, and our emotional brain and our logical brain say, don't do this, do something else. We process that information, so we try to make the right decisions. Now, as our cognitive skills improve, we get better at that. Now, something about an older individual, it isn't that, older individuals lose their cognitive skills. Their processing is a little slower. So it isn't that they, lose their intelligence. They may not be processing as fast as before. And many people will get upset with an older person who can't drive as crisply as they did before, or process something as well, or understand something as well as they did before, simply because their cognitive skills have started to decline a little bit. They're still smart. They just can't do it as fast as they did before. So anyway, working memory, the here and now, the ability to respond to the stimuli that we're receiving. Something else we encounter, fact memory. Names, dates, places, faces, words, things like historical events, phone numbers, addresses, family members, any kind of facts in a textbook, in a chemistry book, a biology book, an anatomy book. That's all facts. Historical events, those are dates, July 4th, 1776, signing of the Declaration of Independence. That is they signed it the day before, that's beside the point. The celebration of American independence. Okay, that is a fact. That is a fact that shows up in history books, or your birthday is a fact, your whatever, those are all facts. What kind of car you drive, that's a fact, where you live is a fact. So now those things are, explicit information. Skill memory is the memory of how to do things, to drive a car, to use your phone, to repair something, to something as simple as how you cut the grass. All this is skill memory. Playing sports, using your computer, playing various games in the computer. This is all motor activities that you've learned through practice and you get better at. Skill memory. So, something as simple as how do you dress yourself? Things that some people who've had a stroke have to relearn. How do you feed yourself? How do you walk? These are motor activities that we've learned through lots and lots and lots of practice. And it's very difficult to unlearn these skills. Dementia patients, for example, may forget all sorts of stuff. They may forget names. They may forget what they had for breakfast, or or things like that. But some of the last things to go are organizational skills and instructions on and their ability to drive a vehicle. Many dementia patients can still drive up until they've lost a lot of their other memories, but they still retain that skill memory in how to drive a car. They may not know where they're going, and they don't know who they're going to go see when they get there, but they can still drive and drive fairly well. Now, a lot of the fact and skill memory are stored in the areas of the brain, of the cortex, where we need to use them. So near all the association areas. The visual association area, for example, would have fact memory stored on names and faces or addresses. The skills would be found near the cerebellum, maybe near the motor, the premotor and the primary motor areas of the frontal lobe, frontal cortex. So the hippocampus and the amygdala are going to tie them in to the limbic system. Do certain memories, factoid or skill memory, trigger an emotional response? That's where the limbic system comes into play. Okay. Now, problems that we have in the brain. Brain can be damaged. What we call it a cerebrovascular accident, a CVA, or a stroke, commonly called a stroke. Number 3 killer after heart attack and cancer. You can have 2 types of strokes. You can have an ischemic stroke, where you cut off the blood flow, or you can have a hemorrhagic stroke where a blood vessel ruptures and you're bleeding out. Cerebral ischemia is caused by reduced blood flow. Ischemia means you're not getting enough oxygen to the cells and the cells die because there's no blood supply going there. So ischemia, ischemic strokes, cut off blood supply. There's a clot in the middle of an artery and it blocks the blood flow. And all the brain cells below the artery die in 5 minutes. The shortage of oxygen is called hypoxia, and the damage here spreads rapidly. Glutamate, one of those excitatory neurotransmitters, starts being released from the damaged cells and triggers apoptosis in all the neurons around it. So individuals that are at risk are ones with high blood pressure, heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, obesity, and alcohol issues. So all the things that, are all interrelated. So strokes kill if they're not caught in time. Now there is a medication called tissue plasminogen activator that breaks down a clot in the artery. If that's given within the first 3 hours, and we can get we can break up the clot, and it may not have, there may not be permanent damage, or at least it may minimize the effect. So strokes, either a blood vessel has ruptured and blood's spewing out all over the brain. Well, since the brain is inside the skull, that fluid, that blood's coming out, doesn't have anywhere to go, and it can start putting pressure on the brain and destroying brain cells by compressing them, and also reducing the amount of oxygen the cells are getting, or we can reduce the blood flow. Ischemic strokes or hemorrhagic strokes. So now, something else that occurs is what we call a TIA, a transient ischemic attack. Impaired blood flow. It's a few minutes, 5 or 10 minutes of dizziness and disorientation and maybe paralysis and numbness. It's like a mini stroke, only it doesn't last very long. And you treat it with aspirin, because aspirin reduces the stickiness of platelets. Aspirin tends to allow clots not to occur. Anticoagulants prevent clots from occurring. So your patient's taking aspirin or an anticoagulant or both, they may have to have some sort of clot removal in the artery itself, but TIAs are essentially like a red flag. Your patient has had this experience, 10-minute, numbness, paralysis, inability to speak, dizziness, whatever, and then it goes away and everything's fine. It's a red flag that it may be leading to something else. It may not be, but it usually is often looked at as a red flag. Now, injuries to the brain. There are 2 types of injuries that we refer to. We have what's known as a contusion in the brain. A blow to the brain causes tissue damage and bleeding. Bleeding in the brain destroys brain tissue. We have what's known as a subdural hematoma. We compress the brain tissue by bleeding here because the blood doesn't know where to go and you can't compress fluids. And this is what the brain looks like after a a subdural hematoma. We've destroyed all that brain tissue in there because the blood has compressed it and compressed it and compressed it. Contusions are caused by damage to one side of the brain or the other, also by the brain bouncing back and forth, and it actually it actually causes a lesion, a laceration in the brain where we're bleeding out. A concussion is totally different. A concussion is where your patient is rendered unconscious. There's no physical damage to the brain, but they've been essentially, as they say, knocked unconscious. And then they're disoriented and confused. There's no apparent physical damage that can be detected anywhere. So, and it appears that the effects of concussions are cumulative. Brain disorders, Alzheimer's. We hear a lot about Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is an accumulation of plaque, of a plaque-like material that accumulates around the neurons in the brain and causes dementia. They lose cognitive skills. It is a progressive disorder. Parkinson's disease occurs from the breakdown of the lack of enough dopamine to keep the basal ganglia in check. Huntington's disease is a protein that it's a genetic disorder that causes the cerebral cortex to degenerate and essentially rot away. This is what an Alzheimer's brain looks like over here versus a healthy brain. Damage, the greatest amount of damage occurs in the area of the hippocampus so that new memories can't be laid down. Your dementia patient will often remember everything that happened to them as far back as childhood. They have explicit memories of their life growing up and everything, but they can't remember what they had for breakfast that day because of the damage to the hippocampus. So we see how the cortex essentially shrinks in here. The areas that are involved in thinking, planning, and memories are the areas that are lost. So, now the spinal cord. Spinal cord is the other part of the central nervous system. We have spinal cord reflexes, like the patellar reflex, or yanking your hand back from something hot or sharp or something like that. We can we integrate nerve impulses. We have the tracts, the white myelinated tracts in the spinal cord that send information up to the brain and back down to the effectors. The spinal cord is protected by the meninges, just like the same meninges that surround the brain surround the spinal cord, and they are bathed with the same cerebrospinal fluid that covers the brain, goes through the ventricles, and then moves down into the spinal cord itself. So, spinal cord starts at the end of the medulla oblongata and extends all the way down to thoracic 12. So right below our ribs, where the last thoracic vertebrae is, right about here. The structure at the end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris, and below that we have a collection of spinal nerves called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail because of the way the nerves stretch out. You can see the cauda equina here. They look like the tail of a horse. How long is the spinal cord? About 18 inches, and it's about a ½ an inch wide. It's about the size of your thumb, maybe your thumb or your first finger. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now, the brain has 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Here we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So, and the entire central nervous system ends between lumbar 2 and lumbar 1 and lumbar 2. So right about here is where we start referring to the spinal nerves feed into and come out of the spinal cord all the way down. So, now within the spinal cord, we have gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is the area that's shaped like a butterfly. This is the unmyelinated axons and the cell bodies. And this is where we have our integration neurons here. And the white area around there are where the tracks, the large axons run up and down to the brain. And you can see the illustration there. And on our model here, it looks something, see if I can get it to show up for you here. There we go. There is our spinal cord. This is the gray matter here, and this is the white matter. These are all the tracks. These are examples of down here. These are nerves leading the spinal cord, and we have both a dorsal and a ventral surface where we have sensory input and motor output on our spinal cord. Let's get to our discussion here. Okay, so there is a canal called the central canal. The central canal runs right through the middle of the spinal cord. It is continuous with the fourth ventricle, and it is full of cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the dorsal horn is going to be on the front, and the dorsal horns are on the back, and the ventral horns are on the front. The dorsal horns where the dorsal and the ventral horns are located here. Not on that one, on this one. Here we go. Looking at our little model now. These are the dorsal horns here. The dorsal horns are on the belly side of our bodies. And dorsal horns are matched by, the dorsal horns are on our backside, like the dorsal fin on a shark. So these are the dorsal horns up here, and these are the ventral horns down here. The ventral horns are on our belly side. The dorsal horns are on our backside. The dorsal horns receive sensory input. The ventral horns have motor output. There we go. So here is our dorsal horn here, and there is our our ventral horn here. So there's sensory input and motor output. You'll notice that both the sensory and the motor output are shared in the overall structure. They're separate signals, but they're shared in these structures. So now, okay. So there is our gray matter and our white matter. In this case, the white matter is dark and the gray matter is light. I don't know why it's backwards. The neurons, the cell bodies of the neurons are found in the butterfly. The unmyelinated axons and the dendrites are found in there. And we have the dorsal and ventral horns. So we see this is the anterior region here. So these are the dorsal horns out here, and these are the ventral horns down here. Dorsal horns are on the back side, ventral horns here. This is motor input on the dorsal side, and this is sensory input on the dorsal side and motor output on the ventral side. So the tracks go up and down. Sensory goes up in the white matter. Motor goes down in the white matter. The dorsal horns contain sensory input, and the ventral horns are motor output. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now let's We know what this, we talked about spinal reflexes before. The integration center is in the middle of the gray matter, where we process sensory input with the integration center, and we have the motor output. These are the spinal reflexes. So things like, jerking your hand back from something hot or sharp is a spinal reflex. The patellar response is a jerking your hand back, is kicking your leg out. That is a spinal reflex. So, problems with trauma to the spinal cord, paralysis, and is a loss of motor function, flaccid paralysis, the ventral root in the front of the spinal cord is damaged. The motor nerve can't send a signal to the muscle. So there is no contraction of the muscle. The muscle is paralyzed, but it is limp. Flaccid paralysis. There's no control over the muscles. Spastic paralysis involves when you damage the primary cortex. The primary motor cortex is damaged. The spinal neurons are functional, but the signals are irregular. So you have constriction with no voluntary control. Flaccid paralysis and spastic paralysis. With flaccid paralysis, the damage is at the level of the ventral horn. The motor output from the spinal cord doesn't work. Spastic paralysis, the horn works, but the brain doesn't. If we cut the spinal cord, depending on the level of the damage, if we transect the spinal cord, if we transect it in the area of the first thoracic, between T1 and L1, between first thoracic and first lumbar, it usually results in paraplegia, where the lower half of the body is paralyzed. If we transect it in the cervical region, somewhere in like C3, C4, somewhere in that region, we get quadriplegia, where we have paralysis from essentially the neck down. And that is everything we're going to talk about on the brain and spinal cord. Any questions on any of this? Okay. Then on Wednesday, we're going to start on chapter 13 and take a look at the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So we'll get out of here. And remember, there is no lab today. We're done with lab. So you don't have to log into Zoom. Your afternoon is now yours. So anyway, I'll get us out of here and I'll see you all on Wednesday.